There are so many cat units in Battle Cats nowadays, and it's very hard to keep track or keep count of. I can't even give a specific number because they'll probably add more cats by the time I'm finished working on this video. Of course, with this many cat units in the game, there will be extremely good units and extremely bad ones. A lot of the useless units usually comes from collabs, basic seasonal event stages, and the monthly event stages. Stuff that you would usually just have for collections rather than for actual use. But the kind that I wanted to highlight today is a unit that is not a bad unit, but is a bad unit. Don't get me wrong, this unit is actually extremely powerful, but this unit is not great in terms of how it's created and how it was expected to be used. And so let's talk about the true form of Flower Cat, Bomber Cat. First, let's go over the base form, Flower Cat. It's a unit that you get from swiping the cat base door in the menu god knows how many times. I don't think anybody has figured out exactly whether the requirement is to like swipe an X amount of time or swipe how fast or something like that. Just keep spamming the door until you get lucky. It is still one of the most unique ways to get cat units in the game. It's kind of cryptic, it's pretty cool. Eventually, you'll get Flower Cat, a simple single target unit with a 20% chance to freeze black enemies. This unit, to put it bluntly, is not great. Even in early game, he rarely gets any use as his freeze chance is very low, his freeze duration is pretty short, and he's only single target. He does have decent range and decent speed and a pretty good startup attack animation, but it doesn't really help his case that much. Black enemies also usually just comes in big groups, so the single target hurts a lot. Not to mention, most black enemies also have a high knockback count, making them harder to pin down with debuffs. If anything, it's usually just easier to brute force most black enemies through high damaging area attacks like spamming Paris Cat. So Flower Cat gets very little to no usages. We also have a similar gacha unit being Gunslinger Cat, who is also a single target anti-black debuffer, this time with a chance to slow black enemies. But while Gunslinger lacks in consistency, he does kinda make it up with a solid standing range so that he can stack up. But even then, nobody still really used Gunslinger outside of like Black Cyclone, that's about it. And so at version 6.2, Ponos decided to give Flower Cat the true form, Bomber Cat. To unlock Bomber Cat, you first need to beat the chapter 3 of Into the Future, then you just need to play an easy awakening stage, but this awakening stage only appears on the 2nd and 22nd of each month from 2 to 2 PM on your local time and lasts for 2 minutes. So if you have school during that day or during those hours, that is unfortunate. It's time to skip school for Battle Cats. No, don't actually do that. Bomber Cat's true form gives two very simple but very effective changes. One is that his attack is now an area attack, and two is that his freeze chance is now guaranteed. Guaranteed freeze is of course absolutely brutal. If you have two desync Bomber Cats on the field, you can permanently freeze black enemies. The area attack is also super helpful as he has a good enough range to outrange pretty much every common black enemy safely, and he stays safe long enough to persist in the field for a good while so that he can stack up. His speed also allows the player to time him against higher range black enemies like Lenoir. He still isn't the absolute best against some black enemy peons who has loads of knockback count like Doge Darks or Gory Blacks or SPK, but at least he's now a pretty reliable unit that can be super impactful against black enemies that he works against. He definitely was and still is one of the best anti-black units in the game. So then what is the problem here? Is he just quote-unquote bad because he's like too good? Is that it? Like the similar case with the Dasly video where Dasly's just so powerful that it makes like a stale meta? I wouldn't say it's quite like that actually. Besides, Bomber Cat in particular isn't even that broken, believe it or not. There's so many other anti-black choices which is of similar strength, oftentimes even better than Bomber Cat in some black stages. However, to understand the problem of Bomber Cat, you first need to understand the circumstances in which Bomber Cat was created. You see, Bomber Cat wasn't just created out of nowhere. There is one very specific reasons on the existence of Bomber Cat. Bomber Cat owes his entire existence due to an enemy named Razorback. Razorback is a black variant of the Boar. Just like with most Boar enemies, Razorback is a melee unit with fast attack speed, good health, and really high damage output. Razorback in particular was given way higher than average speed and damage. In 100% magnification, his attack deals 20,000 damage per hit, and at half health, his damage is strengthened by an extra 50%, making him deal 30,000 damage per hit. This is way higher compared to other Boar variants. His health is somewhat on the lower side, but he's still pretty tanky while having 2 knockback counts. For comparison, the Angel Boar variant, Borophim, also has a similar DPS with Razorback. However, Borophim is far less problematic since we have Ramen Cat, a very tanky anti-angel meat shield that is usually a core unit in angel stages which can stall Borophim effectively, making it much easier to handle. On the other hand, while we do have great anti-black meat shields like Jetpack, Chibigao, or Nono, these units aren't available for everyone. Jetpack is locked behind a late game Advent shop, and Chibigao and Nono are collab units, so a lot of players players wouldn't really have access to maybe one of them. Plus, stalling Razorback with just anti-black meat shields might not cut it. If the stage has other non-black enemies supporting it, or when Razorback is strengthened, these meat shields could still get shredded. Jetpack also has this weird problem of being too long-ranged, which makes it imperfect for stalling Razorback. Aside from that, Razorback also sometimes appears in 150% magnification, making his DPS absurdly high, especially on strengthen. While for comparison, Borofim until now, even in ZL, still has not appeared outside of 100% magnification. Now, going back to the point before Bombercat's existence, there was actually already 3 Razorback stages existing in Stories of Legend. In all of these stages, Razorback spawns by timer, meaning that it is possible to beat the stage before Razorback even spawns. And so, unsurprisingly, people would often just try to go for the cheese strat instead of trying to fight Razorback. If you want to fight these stages quote-unquote normally, you're basically required to use debuffers like Flower Cat, Gunslinger Cat, and Pumpkin Cat to slow and freeze Razorback. But these units are very unreliable and very inconsistent to say the least. You're going to have to rely on mad luck to be able to freeze or slow Razorback in the first place, and you would usually need to do some sort of like luring or stacking setup to even have a chance to get some sort of semi-consistent results. So it can be very infuriating if your luck is not on point. If the best way to fight an enemy is to not fight the enemy, then there's probably something wrong with the design, you know? Clearly this enemy was not really well balanced, and so Bombercat is Ponos' answer to this problem. Guaranteed freeze gives it a massive consistency against Razorback without relying on mad luck. Bombercat already has a very short cooldown too, so you can just desync 2 Bombercats for a permafreeze, which is even easier to set up if you pair it with Research Combo. I have a video about how busted Research Combo is, go watch that video if you're interested. Alternatively, if you have a full anti-black fruit from the future stages, you can also simply just use 2 small or 1 medium freeze up combo, which allows a single Bombercat to permafreeze alone. Bombercat also has a high enough range to catch multiple black enemies at once, which is especially handy if Razorback is paired up with other melee units that may have lower range, so that Bombercat is able to catch Razorback even if he's behind an enemy. Bombercat is, without a doubt, a really good unit, and thanks to his power, the previous 2 Razorback stages are now not just playable, but has become incredibly easier. You just need to lure Razorback, freeze it with Bomber, then burst it down and you win the stage. And so one update later at 6.3, they released another Razorback stage, the Holy Exploit, where for the first time ever, Razorback's spawn is not on a timer, but is on base hit, forcing the player to actually fight Razorback without cheesing it. The stage also features Borofim and several other dodges to disrupt your units, making it harder to deal with both boars at once. But Bomber's area attack allows you to consistently permafreeze Razorback even if Borofim is in front, which allows you to stall Razorback as you deal with everything else on the stage. Bombercat is a perfect fit for this stage. But maybe Bombercat's a bit too perfect for this stage. To put it simply, this stage has no viable counters other than Bombercat. Most other anti-black debuffers are single target, which can miss if anything is in front of Razorback, but everything else in the Holy Exploit are melee range, so it is very common for other enemies to stand in front of Razorback, so single target anti-black units aren't really good here. Anti-black meat shields like Nono or Chibikao are also not that great here, as they would be shredded by the Borofim. Not to mention, since you want to rely on Ramen Cat for the Borofim, you want to specifically freeze Razorback so to make sure that Razorback doesn't hit your Ramen Cat. So, Bombercat's like not just the best option here, but it's also basically your only option. And yes, before you start, technically speaking, you can beat every Razorback stages without Bombercat, whether it's from your like level 50 max talented Yukimura or your Mitama or your Oda Nobunaga or whatever. But you understand what I mean when I say that under a quote-unquote normal circumstances, Bomber is the designated way to deal with Razorback. I think you can at least agree that the stage are absolutely expecting you to bring Bombercat. But this reliance on Bombercat creates this really weird like unstoppable force versus immovable object problem. And given how accessible Bombercat is, it wouldn't really make sense to not design Razorback stage around Bombercat. Plus, since Bombercat is a special cat, you can also use him on 4 crown restrictions. Why bother trying to make a stage where Razorback is easy to deal with when pretty much everyone has Bombercat? And so even until now, every Razorback stage will always be designed around Bombercat, whether it be pairing Razorback with mixed trait stage, which Bombercat is good against, or spawning Razorback without giving the player much time or money to prepare, which means that most other anti-black units are not reliable. At this point, it's almost as if like Razorback is like a gimmick enemy, just to force the player to bring Bombercat. To make things worse, the interactions between Bombercat and Razorback is just always so stale. The current existing stages with Razorback always has just a game plan of perma-freeze Razorback while keeping your Bombercat safe until Razorback eventually dies. There are stages like Border Between Worlds, which has tried to make something more interesting, having the combination of Zamel and Johnny Leon alongside Razorback, which forces the player to be more careful with your timing of Bombercat as to not get hit by Johnny Leon's LD attacks, while at the same time making sure that the player is not too aggressive to push into Zamel's range, which could potentially kill your Bombercat. I would say this is one of the more interesting Razorback stage, but even then Razorback here still kind of feels like a gimmick enemy that ultimately still just hinges on bringing Bombercat. And I would say Border Between Worlds is amongst one of the better Razorback stages, but even that doesn't really say much. Razorback interaction in general is still always very samey. Another problem about bringing Bomber is that Bombercat's just not great for anything else. Since Bomber has low damage and low health, you can't use it to tank, nor you can't use it for damage. If a stage has Razorback as its only black enemy, this means that slotting in Bombercat in your lineup means you're using it for Razorback and Razorback only. This is especially worse in Growing Strange, where compressing your lineup is very important, as you need to bring a lineup that works in 8 different stages. And since one of the stage features Razorback, if you want to beat all 8 stages, you kinda have to bring Bomber if you want to beat that stage, right? But slotting in a single unit that only is used for a single enemy in between 8 different stages, where he'd be useless in literally everything else, does not feel that good to bring. I also have a whole video talking about Growing Strange if you want to hear me talk about Growing Strange. Now, normally I actually like units that are more specific in usage. I generally prefer if units have their more obvious weakness so that they can't be just used literally everywhere, but this one is a negative point for specifically Bombercat because of how forced you are to bring him for Razorback. I don't think this problem would have been that bad if Bombercat was designed this way. For sure, Razorback is already designed pretty badly, but I think Bombercat's design just makes this problem worse. Bombercat's just way too much of a perfect counter to Razorback that you have to design stages around Bomber's existence. But in an alternate universe where Bombercat is weaker, they could go back and like dial down on how Razorback is used, perhaps allowing for a more interesting stage dynamic, which can be more interesting. Maybe they could have made it so that Bomber's freeze is not guaranteed, but simply more consistent. Maybe better proc chance, maybe better freeze duration, better spammability, etc. Something similar like Sanzo, you know? Then you can still justify using him with other anti-black units, rather than making everything to hinge down to just using Bombercat alone. But I think it's probably a bit late to try to fix this problem this way. Nerfing Bombercat would be outrageous, let's be real. Players would really hate it if their favorite powerful units gets nerfed in a single player game, so that's definitely a no-go. Trying to make Razorback stages to fully counter Bombercat is also difficult. If, for example, you make a stage that has enemies with like Omni, Piercing, or Surge attacks, whatever stuff that can just aim to kill Bombercat, then there's a chance that you just end up making the stage way too difficult, as Razorback without Bombercat is an absolute killing machine, especially at 150% magnification or higher crown difficulties. While it's not new that Ponos have actually tried to make some stages that tries to somewhat soft counter Bombercat a couple of times. In the stage Cats in the Stars, they tried to pair Razorback with Doge Curse Cannon, and in Tropical Garden they used Otom, a relic range enemy with piercing attack with Curse ability as well. Curse is an ability that disables your unit's ability, so the idea is that you can't fully rely on Bombercat as the curse would disable its freeze effect. These were designed so that you would use talented Gunslinger instead. At this point, Gunslinger has the talent of Curse Resistance, which can significantly cut down the curse's duration by a huge amount, making it theoretically a good fit to be able to still deal with Razorback under the threat of Curse. However, Gunslinger still sucks here. Gunslinger has very unreliable proc chance and mediocre slow duration, which isn't really preferable against enemies as deadly as Razorback. And single target can really hurt as he can potentially hit other enemies instead of Razorback. Plus, the stage doesn't really give you that much time or money to effectively stack Gunslinger. To make matters worse, Bombercat is still perfectly usable against these stages. The Doge Curse Cannon has very limited range, which allows you to just lure Razorback outside of the cannon's range and perma-freeze him there. And Otom also cannot hit Bomber Cat if you just protect it with meat shields, or simply put your Bomber Cat behind your base. So while there are some attempts here, ultimately it's just another usual Razor Bomber stage. It's still definitely possible to create a more interesting Razorback stage with what we have. I think Cats in the Star has a decent idea, but maybe could be executed better. I think by either having Curse Cannon to cover the entire stage so that luring would be riskier, or maybe adding base snipers like Tacky or Hacky to discourage luring, forcing the player to choose to still lure and risk your base getting chipped off, or play from afar under the threat of constant curse. This could make a more interesting stage dynamic and maybe even validates Gunslinger usage more. On the other hand, they've also definitely made some easier Razorback stages, especially stages that features purely black enemies, which is generally more lenient to be countered by other anti-black units other than Bomber Cat. But these are not really any better. They're kinda just easy like filler stages. Also, you can still just save up slots using Bomber Cat anyways, so in fairness, there's quite a lot of enemies out there that are pretty difficult to make interesting use out of them, but Razorback in particular has always just been completely hard countered by the same unit for the past 7 years. I think a more successful attempt they had at making a Razorback stage work is on the Otherworld Colosseum. Otherworld Colosseum is an event stage that features very interesting special rules and gimmicks to your units. One of the gimmick is cooldown equality, which has a special rule that sets all of your units cooldown to be 16 seconds, and you are not allowed to use research combo. The fourth stage of cooldown equality features Razorback with other proper enemy supports. Cooldown equality hurts Bomber Cat a lot, as he does rely on perma-freezing from either having 2 Bomber Cats at once or using freeze combo. But bringing freeze combo might be too much slots wasted, and keeping Bomber Cat safe here is pretty difficult since your meat shields are also stuck in 16 seconds cooldown. 16 seconds cooldown also means that having 2 Bomber Cats in the field would be a very difficult task, so you might have to rely on other anti-black units to deal with Razorback if you can't burst it down fast enough. This is most definitely one of the more interesting Razorback stage, so I think that's a step to the right direction. So hey, good job, that's actually a pretty decent Razorback stage. Although cooldown equality does kind of encourage using Cyberpunk, which is I don't really want to get into that. But at least Bomber Cat's problem is mainly just on Razorback, right? Most other black enemies can still have varied counters, as Bomber Cat isn't always the best against every single other black enemies. Perhaps other anti-black units like Pizza Cat or Heavy Assault CAT might be preferable, but Bomber most definitely is still a bit of a problem when designing new black enemies, especially if you want to make a new tanky black boss enemies, as it is very easy for Bomber Cat to set up a perma-freeze when focusing down on a single enemy, which is why almost all of the recent black enemies that we have are freeze immune, like Okame, Raging Gory, Dark Joe, and Kuro Croc, and that's all because of Bomber Cat's existence. Dark Doer, being a Sage, also has freeze resistance, but you can bet your money that if he's not a Sage, he's definitely also gonna have freeze immunity. That's how strong Bomber Cat's presence is on designing a new black enemy. But you might think, well, this problem isn't really new, right? I mean, there's always strong units that affects how newer enemies are designed, and frankly speaking, busted units nowadays are really not uncommon. Earlier we touched on Ramen Cat being a staple anti-angel meat shield. I think it's no surprise that at this point every angel focused stages nowadays are always balanced around having Ramen Cat because of how powerful Ramen is. Octopus Cat is also another offender, being the first easily accessible wave blocker unit. Still kind of is the only accessible wave blocker unit. Wave blockers are able to nullify any wave attack it touches, which is crazy good. It even comes to the point where people were questioning if this ability was even balanced at all. Back then, the hardest stage in the game was widely considered to be Dark Web 3-star, which is a wave focus stage, but once Octopus exists, this stage immediately became a joke. You do still need a little bit of a setup to make it work, but it's a very simple setup to turn the hardest stage in the game into an instant cakewalk. Apple Cat is also another example, who actually has a very similar fate with Flower Cat. Apple Cat was a single target unit with a mediocre chance to freeze red enemies, and in true form, iCat gained area attack and guaranteed chance to freeze, and is also able to perma-freeze red enemies if you have 2 of them desynced. Exactly the same like Bomber Cat. Speaking of red enemies, Courier Cat is also another example of an absurdly powerful unit. Courier Cat is a spammable LD rusher unit with massive damage against red and Behemoth Slayer ability. He has great stats outside of his niche and crushes a big amount of red enemies and Behemoth enemies in the game. Courier is also definitely a problem. He's going to be in your lineup in pretty much much every single red or behemoth focus stage due to how powerful he is, especially against Ahirujo, who is a red and behemoth hybrid, as Ahirujo receives 10 times damage multiplier from Courier Cat. Behemoths in general are really odd, and I've also talked about why I really dislike behemoth subtraits before. There's also Cyberpunk. I don't want to talk about this one. Can't Juice made a video about Cyberpunk and it's a whole different kind of worms. I would highly recommend to go check that video out if you're interested. There's still a decent chunk of other units with this similar kind of problem too, but at least I think these units don't feel as bad as Bomber Cat to use. Let me explain. Ramen Cat, right, for example, even though he's a nearly must pick in Angel stages, he's mainly just there to stall for you. You still get to do the damaging and everything else with other units, so he's just one piece of the puzzle, still allowing for a bigger freedom in other aspects, especially in depending on which Angel enemies you're against. Arguably, you can say it's similar to Bomber Cat, as you still need to burst Razorback down with something else, but with Ramen at least there's still some sort of resistance from the enemy, and different Angel enemies requires different solutions. Plus, Mixed Trade stage still can give him trouble and can make for a more interesting dynamic in your team, which is far less stale than Bomber Cat's interaction. This is also the same as Octopus Cat. Despite being strong against wave stages, Octopus can have different dynamic against different wave enemies, whether it be having to be timed against like Boar Juniors, or having to be sparingly used against Yukan or Hermit Cat, which outranges Octopus. Not to mention, all wave stages are still very doable even without wave blockers, since we have a pretty good amount of wave immune units nowadays. So even if some stages try to hard counter the usage of Octopus, strategizing a lineup around a wave stage can still be pretty fun. And then going back to iCat, despite having similar treatment for the true form, iCat is actually far from being as strong as Bomber Cat. iCat has a much shorter range and much longer cooldown, which makes it notably harder to permafreeze red enemies or even just survive at all. Having fast pusher enemies in the stage would already be a massive threat to iCat, as it is very easy to break his permafreeze if you're not careful enough. Plus, iCat isn't really the only viable answer to red boars. We have a lot of other reliable counters to deal with boars, like Ro or Manic Island or Can, or even units like Witch Cat. They're all still viable against boar depending on each stage scenario. Bringing iCat is not an instant win, and not bringing an iCat is not an instant lose. And Courier, okay, well, Courier is a pretty bad one. Courier is actually just really powerful, but even then, some fast pushing enemies like Shy Boy or Jackrabbits can still slip by Courier, and it's very much possible to make a red focus stage or to just implement a red enemy in the stage that is just pretty engaging, and maybe the better answer sometimes might not be Courier. Courier's problem is mainly around behemoths, as you're pretty much always going to bring him against behemoth stages due to how powerful he is, and how he's still just good outside of behemoths. But even though you're still going to bring Courier in pretty much every single behemoth stages, at least the interactions that you would have still kinda depends on the team that you're bringing and the enemy that you're against. Hell, even one of the red behemoth hybrid enemy, Deonil, who, by the way, as a reminder, receives 10 times damage from Courier, actually, Deonil soft counters Courier back. Deonil has a high chance to freeze and constant mini wave, which makes it Courier actually have a hard time approaching. This can make a more engaging fight. There's also just quite a lot of behemoth enemies in the game, so Courier's dynamic against each behemoths can be ever so slightly different, even though most of the time the entire game plan of Courier is to just constantly spam it until the enemy dies. But it's, I would say, not as stale as Bomber Cat and Razorback. Although arguably you might kind of say he does have a similar problem with Ahirujo, but you know, Ahirujo is kind of hopeless anyways, but you know. I'm not saying that these units are completely off the hook for being badly designed or something like that, no, especially Courier. But at least these units feel better to use than Bomber Cat. iCat might be a great unit, but he's never required, nor does he break that much red stages. Ramen might be a must pick in Angel focus stages, but at least he doesn't trivialize every single Angel enemy all by himself. Octopus might be helpful in wave stages, but he's not always needed, and he has many solid alternatives. Courier, okay, Courier's pretty bad. Courier does destroy red and behemoth enemies, but he's not entirely needed either. He does have a little bit of some alternatives, and he's still pretty good outside of his target trait, so bringing him isn't a waste. Bomber Cat is actually a decently balanced unit against most black enemies. Sometimes pure damage might be more worse than his guaranteed freeze. But when it comes to specifically Razorback, not only is he essentially a must pick, but bringing him also just counters Razorback way too perfectly. Like as if this is a rock, paper, paper scissors game. And yes, again, technically it's possible to deal with Razorback stages without Bombercat, but dealing with Razorback without Bombercat is also usually really unfun and really unsatisfying anyways. I'd rather just give in and bring in Bombercat than having to constantly rely on Gunslinger's 30% chance to slow. It's a lose-lose either way. Bombercat might not be the worst unit in the game in terms of like how broken he is or something. There are so many other units more powerful than Bombercat, but I consider Bombercat to be one of the worst units in the game in terms of the terrible dependency he's created. Razorback now needs Bombercat, and Bombercat now needs Razorback. Razorback stage always needs to keep that one most powerful counterpick in mind, and Bombercat's existence validates these crazy usages of what is supposedly an absurdly powerful enemy. They have such a weird relationship. It's like a toxic Yaoi relationship. Or maybe it's like a doomed Yaoi. They were meant for each other in the worst way possible. And we're just the third wheel of this Yaoi fanfic. Anyways, I think that's about it. Do you have any thoughts or questions, or perhaps do you think anything's possibly even worse than Bombercats in this regards? Don't say Cyberpunk please, or Sniper, or Sniperpunk. That's a whole different kind of devil that I really don't want to delve into right now. They're also pretty bad, but I think they're bad in like a different way. But yeah, anyways, I hope you enjoyed and maybe learned a thing or two. And that's all for now. I'll catch you another time. See ya.